It's easy to label someone emotionally unavailable or avoidant and move on. We throw those words around as if they fully capture the complexity of a human being. But when you take a step back, when you strip away the frustration and look beneath the surface, what you find isn't coldness, it's fear. Avoidants aren't heartless, they're scared. They're terrified of being seen, of being known too deeply, because to them, intimacy doesn't mean safety. It means exposure. And exposure feels like losing control. Avoidant behavior often begins long before adulthood. It's rooted in early emotional experiences, sometimes subtle, sometimes traumatic. Maybe as a child, they were taught that love was conditional. That affection came only when they behaved a certain way. Or maybe they learned that showing emotion led to disappointment, rejection, or even punishment. So to protect themselves, they built a system, a psychological defense mechanism. Don't need anyone. Don't rely on anyone. Don't feel too much. And over time, that defense becomes an identity. They start believing they're better off alone because it feels safer than being vulnerable and possibly hurt again. This is where the contradiction lies. Avoidants crave connection just like anyone else. They want to love and be loved. But the moment a relationship starts to feel too real, too emotional, something inside of them panics. Their subconscious mind whispers, "You're losing control. You're being trapped." And so they pull away, not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous. The more you reach out, the more they retreat. It's not rejection in the traditional sense. It's self-preservation. To an avoidant, emotional closeness feels like walking into a fire they've been burned by before. When they meet someone who's emotionally grounded, patient, and stable, part of them is drawn in deeply. That calm presence is magnetic to someone who lives in a constant state of emotional defense. But that same presence also threatens their internal structure. You become a mirror to everything they've been running from: openness, intimacy, vulnerability. And that's when the pattern begins. They create distance. They intellectualize feelings. They find faults, not because you're flawed, but because they need a justification to escape the emotional intensity that scares them. Now here's where the human mind gets fascinating. Most avoidants don't even know why they do this. It's not a conscious choice. It's an automatic response. Their nervous system is wired to avoid emotional risk. When connection deepens, their body literally reacts as if they're under threat. The heart races, the chest tightens, and their first instinct is to withdraw to get space. They might say they need time to think, or that they're not ready for commitment. But what they're really saying is, "I don't know how to feel safe in love." And here's the thing: understanding this doesn't excuse the pain they cause, but it explains it. It gives you clarity instead of confusion. Because when you're on the other side of that dynamic, it's easy to internalize their withdrawal as something you did wrong, as if your love was too much or your presence too intense. But the truth is, their running has little to do with you. It's about their relationship with their own emotions, their inability to sit in vulnerability without feeling like they're losing themselves. So what do you do when you love someone like that? You hold compassion, but you keep your boundaries. You stop trying to rescue them from their own walls, because the more you chase, the higher those walls become. What they need isn't your pursuit, it's your example. They need to see what emotional safety looks like in action. They need to see that love doesn't have to mean surrendering power or identity. But that's something they can only learn by losing it, by realizing what genuine emotional presence feels like once it's gone. And here's the quiet truth about avoidance. They often understand what they had only after they've left it. They'll replay moments in their head, trying to make sense of why they ran. They'll miss your steadiness, your emotional intelligence, your calm energy. But that regret doesn't come from loneliness. It comes from recognition. Recognition that they pushed away the very thing they were looking for all along. We all run from something. Some people run from pain, others from truth, and avoidants run from love, because love demands honesty, and honesty exposes the self. But here's the paradox. The same vulnerability they fear is the only path to true safety. You can't protect yourself from hurt and still receive love fully. Sooner or later, you have to choose. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this: when someone avoids intimacy, it's not proof of your inadequacy, it's evidence of their fear. And fear only loses power when faced with awareness. So don't shrink to make them comfortable. Don't dim your emotional depth to fit their distance. Stand in your truth even if it scares them. Because one day, that truth is exactly what they'll remember and regret losing. Let's talk about the part avoidants rarely admit, the people they can't forget. Because here's the truth: avoidants don't regret leaving everyone. They regret leaving the ones who had something different about them. Not louder love, not more effort, not constant reassurance, but a particular kind of presence. The kind that's calm, confident, and grounded. The kind of energy that doesn't demand, doesn't chase, and doesn't collapse under emotional distance. It's easy to believe that if you just love harder, prove your loyalty, or wait long enough, they'll change. But that's not what leaves a mark on an avoidant's psyche. What lingers is the memory of someone who loved them without losing themselves. Someone who held space for them, but never abandoned their own center. That's what their mind comes back to long after they've left. Those 4 rare traits that make avoidants realize, too late, that they walked away from something real. The first trait is emotional control. This doesn't mean suppressing your feelings or pretending you're fine. It means learning to respond instead of react. Avoidants thrive on emotional distance, and when they sense chaos, it validates their fear that closeness equals instability. But when you're calm, when you can communicate your feelings without explosions or ultimatums, you're doing something extraordinary. You're showing them what emotional safety actually looks like. You're proving that love can be expressed through composure, not control. Your steadiness disarms their defenses because it contradicts everything they've been taught to expect from intimacy. And that calmness, even if they don't acknowledge it, stays with them. The second trait is unapologetic self-worth. You know your value, whether they validate it or not. You don't chase, you don't beg, and you don't audition for love. This kind of confidence isn't arrogance. It's self-trust. It's the quiet understanding that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's capacity to see it. For an avoidant, this is deeply unsettling and deeply magnetic at the same time, because they're used to people bending, compromising, overgiving. When you stand firm, but when you don't participate in that emotional dance, they lose the sense of control they've built their comfort on. And while that might drive them away in the moment, it's the very thing they'll admire and miss later. Then comes consistent warmth without pressure. This is an art. It's not about being distant. It's about being kind without being needy. You show care, but you don't suffocate. You express love, but you give space. You don't weaponize silence or affection. You hold both with grace. This kind of balance creates an emotional environment where they feel both safe and free, something avoidants rarely experience. It's like sunlight through a window, constant, gentle, not blinding. And because it's so rare, they underestimate its impact until they can't find it again. That's when they remember you, not because you demanded attention, but because you gave warmth without strings attached. And the fourth trait, maybe the most powerful of all, is purpose-driven independence. You have a life that's full, meaningful, and self-directed. You're not waiting for someone to complete you. You've built a rhythm that doesn't revolve around their presence or absence. This kind of independence isn't about detachment. It's about alignment. You're anchored in something bigger than the relationship. You have goals, passions, and values that give your days meaning. And to an avoidant who often feels trapped by emotional reliance, this is deeply attractive because you represent freedom within connection, a paradox they've never learned to hold. When you put these four traits together, emotional control, self-worth, warmth without pressure, and independence, you create a kind of energy that challenges the avoidant's entire emotional architecture. They can't label you as needy or too much. They can't justify leaving by blaming your chaos. Instead, they leave knowing they've lost someone who was emotionally intelligent, grounded, and capable of real connection. And that's what stings the most. It's not that they lost love, they lost safety in love. Eventually, when the adrenaline of avoidance fades, when they've distanced themselves enough to feel the emptiness settle in, they begin to reflect. They remember your calm voice, your ability to give space without resentment, your steady sense of self. And in that quiet reflection, something uncomfortable rises, a realization that they left someone who had already mastered the emotional stability they've been avoiding all along. This is where regret lives, not in the loneliness, but in the recognition. Recognition that you embodied what they couldn't balance. You showed them a version of love that didn't demand they surrender themselves, only that they show up honestly. And because they couldn't, they'll remember you as the one that got away, not because of fantasy, but because of growth. So if you've ever wondered whether your calmness mattered, or whether your strength was wasted, let me tell you, it wasn't. Every ounce of that emotional intelligence left an imprint. You didn't lose by being steady, kind, or self-assured. They lost by running from it. And here's the takeaway: never shrink your emotional maturity to meet someone else's avoidance. Never trade self-respect for closeness. Because real connection, lasting, transformative connection, doesn't come from chasing those who run. It comes from standing still in your truth and letting those who fear depth learn, in time, what they walked away from. There's a moment that happens after the avoidant leaves, the silence. It's not loud or dramatic. It's the kind of silence that creeps in slowly, but when the adrenaline fades and there's no longer anyone to prove independence to. And at first, that silence feels like relief, freedom, space. They tell themselves they made the right choice, that distance is clarity. But what avoidants rarely expect is how quickly that space starts to echo. Because when the noise of the relationship fades, they're left with the sound of their own thoughts. And that's when the internal war begins. Avoidants live in contradiction. They crave closeness but fear it. They want love but reject the vulnerability that makes love possible. So, when they walk away from someone who was emotionally grounded, someone who loved them calmly and consistently, it's not peace they find, it's conflict. Their logical mind says, you did the right thing. You needed space. But their emotional self, the one they've been trying to silence their whole lives, whispers, you lost something real. And that whisper gets louder with time. The first phase after leaving is numbness. It's not sadness. Not yet. It's emotional shutdown. They'll distract themselves with work, new people, routines, or anything that keeps them from sitting with the discomfort of what they've done. This isn't coldness, it's self-protection. To feel too much would mean confronting guilt, regret, or longing, and they've spent a lifetime learning how to avoid that. So they suppress it, they intellectualize it. They might even convince themselves that you were too much, or that it wasn't working. But the mind can only rationalize for so long before emotion demands its turn. And that's when the delayed regret begins. It doesn't come in a wave. It comes in fragments. A song, a scent, a familiar phrase you used to say. Small things that trigger memories they thought they'd buried. Suddenly, that numbness starts to crack, and beneath it is a deep, aching recognition of what they've lost. It's not just you. It's the version of themselves they were when they were with you. The part that felt seen, accepted, and safe even when they couldn't reciprocate fully. The irony is, avoidants often realize the depth of connection only in its absence. Because in the relationship, intimacy feels threatening. But in separation, it feels like oxygen they didn't know they needed. This is why they cycle through confusion and guilt. They'll replay moments in their head, times you showed patience when they withdrew, times you stayed calm when they expected chaos. Those memories are uncomfortable because they don't fit the story they tell themselves. That leaving was about freedom. Deep down, they know they left something steady for the illusion of safety. But the mind is clever. To avoid pain, avoidants often rewrite the narrative. They'll minimize what you meant, or they'll idealize you completely, swinging between detachment and longing. Both are defense mechanisms, because facing the truth that they walked away from something good requires emotional accountability, and accountability demands vulnerability. For someone wired to avoid emotional exposure, that's the hardest thing in the world. What's fascinating is that regret for avoidance isn't immediate, it's progressive. It grows as their emotional bandwidth expands, as they evolve, as they heal. Or sometimes, as they simply get older, they begin to see the difference between comfort and connection. They start to understand that what they mistook for needing space was actually fear. And by the time that realization hits, the person they left has usually grown too. That's part of the pain. They come back to a version of you that no longer needs them, no longer waits for them. And that's when regret transforms into reflection. From a psychological standpoint, this phase is crucial. Regret becomes the teacher avoidance never allowed. It forces them to confront their patterns, to see that running doesn't equal safety, it equals loss. Some will numb that awareness again and move on, repeating the cycle. But some will pause long enough to see the pattern for what it is: self-sabotage disguised as self-protection. And for you, the one they left, understanding this helps you reclaim your peace. Because their silence, their detachment, their emotional distance. It was never a reflection of your inadequacy. It was a mirror of their fear. You were the test of their emotional capacity, and they weren't ready to pass it. That's not your burden to carry. Avoidants don't regret losing the people who chased them, pleaded with them, or made them feel trapped. They regret losing the ones who gave love without pressure, who held space without surrendering self-worth, who left with grace. Because those are the people who force them to see that love and freedom can coexist. And that realization is what hurts the most. It's the awareness that they left the very thing they'd been searching for, simply because they didn't know how to hold it. So if you've ever been on the receiving end of that silence, wondering if they ever think about you, yes, they do, but not in the way you might think. They think of you as a lesson, as the moment they met someone who reflected back the emotional maturity they hadn't yet developed. And that memory doesn't fade. It matures with them, becoming the quiet teacher in the background of every future connection they try to build. Here's what I want you to remember. Their regret isn't your closure. It's their awakening. You don't need to witness it for it to be real, because your peace doesn't depend on their return. It depends on your understanding that you were never the problem, you were the mirror. And eventually, every avoidant looks into that mirror again. There's something profoundly unsettling to an avoidant about silence. The kind that isn't passive-aggressive, isn't cold, but simply peaceful. When someone detaches from them with calmness and grace, it disrupts their entire emotional logic. You see, avoidants expect conflict. They expect pursuit, explanations, and emotional chaos, because that's what confirms their belief that closeness equals danger. But when you respond with quiet composure instead of desperation, it throws their internal system into confusion. Suddenly, the narrative they've told themselves about you and about love doesn't make sense anymore. Avoidants are conditioned to expect the push-pull dynamic. They withdraw, you chase, and that chase reassures them that they're still wanted, still valuable, even as they maintain distance. It's a control loop, one that keeps them emotionally safe without requiring them to grow. But the moment you stop playing your part in that loop, the game ends. And at first they feel relief. They think, finally, space. Finally, peace. But then something strange happens. That silence starts to feel heavy. Your absence doesn't sound like rejection. It feels like reflection. It's the first time they have to sit with the consequences of their own avoidance. Walking away gracefully doesn't mean slamming the door. It means closing it quietly, knowing your worth doesn't need to make noise. It's not punishment. It's self-respect. And here's the psychological truth. The human mind doesn't crave what's constantly available. It craves what it's lost, but still emotionally attached to. When you detach without resentment, you give them space to feel the weight of what they took for granted. It's not revenge. It's reality setting in. Your silence becomes the mirror they can't look away from. It's in that quiet that their rational mind and emotional self start to collide. Logically, they told themselves you were too emotional, too close, or not aligned. But emotionally, they start remembering your calm tone, your kindness, your steadiness. They remember how you didn't try to fix them. You simply accepted them. And now, with no one left to resist, no one to define themselves against, they start to see what they actually ran from. It wasn't you. It was the discomfort of genuine connection. There's a certain kind of power that comes from emotional restraint. Not the kind that manipulates, but the kind that protects your energy. When you stop explaining, defending, or proving, you communicate something profound. I trust myself more than I need to be understood. And for someone used to control, that's disarming, because now you are the one in control, not of them, but of your emotional state. They can't predict your next move. They can't read your silence. And for the first time, they have to question themselves. That's where regret begins, not in the loss itself, but in the self-awareness that follows. You see, walking away with grace doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you started choosing yourself. It's the moment you decide that your peace is worth more than their potential. And in doing that, you shift the dynamic from dependence to empowerment. You're no longer reacting to their distance. You're defining your own. You're no longer waiting for closure. You're creating it. And the irony is, that's the exact moment avoidants often start to feel drawn back. not because they've changed overnight, but because your detachment reawakens their curiosity. Your silence creates space for their mind to wander, and it wanders right back to you. Not to the version of you that tried to fix them, but the version that walked away, centered, calm, and self-assured. That version represents everything they've avoided within themselves. Emotional strength, inner peace, self-trust. But here's where you need to be careful. When that regret surfaces, they may reach out, testing the waters. Not always to reconnect, but to confirm that you're still emotionally available. If you respond from need or nostalgia, the cycle restarts. But if you stay grounded in your detachment, if you respond with kindness but not craving, you maintain your power. You teach through action what words never could be, that real love doesn't chase, it attracts. Philosophically speaking, this is a lesson in emotional sovereignty. The ability to remain whole in the face of separation. Most people mistake love for attachment, but love, real love, requires space. Space for growth, reflection, and choice. Avoidants run because they fear that closeness will consume them. But when you show that connection and independence can coexist, that loving doesn't mean losing yourself, you become unforgettable. You become the person who redefined love in their mind, not through arguments or effort, but through quiet self-respect. And that's what makes graceful detachment so powerful. It's not cold, it's conscious. It's saying, I honor what we had, but I won't abandon myself to preserve it. That kind of strength isn't just healing. It's magnetic. It doesn't close the heart, it refines it. It shows that emotional maturity isn't about winning or losing. It's about choosing peace over power struggles, dignity over drama. So when you walk away, do it with calm. Do it without the need to prove a point or make them see your worth. Because when you no longer chase validation, you embody it. And that's the moment they start to see what they lost. Not a person to control, but a presence they'll never forget. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: your silence is not emptiness. It's a statement. It says, I have nothing left to prove. And that's when everything shifts. Something powerful happens when you stop trying to understand why they left and start focusing on who you're becoming. Because here's the truth. When an avoidant walks away, it's not just the end of a relationship, it's an invitation. A painful, uncomfortable, transformative invitation for you to become what they couldn't. To become emotionally grounded, self-aware, and free. Most people spend months, sometimes years, trying to decode avoidance, analyzing every text, every silence, every sign of remorse. But what actually shifts your life isn't decoding them. It's decoding yourself. It's realizing that the lesson wasn't about how to keep them. It was about how to keep yourself. You were meant to see where you abandoned your own emotional boundaries in the name of connection. You were meant to learn the difference between love and self-sacrifice. Because once you stop chasing closure from them, you start finding it in you. When you begin to heal, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop operating from need and start living from wholeness. That change, that evolution, is something avoidants feel even from afar. You become a mirror to their stagnation. You're no longer the emotionally dependent person they left. You're composed, centered, and living with purpose. And for someone who's used to defining themselves through avoidance, that shift is unsettling. It confronts them with a truth they've been avoiding their whole life, that emotional maturity is power. Avoidants often leave thinking they're choosing freedom, but what they actually choose is isolation. Freedom without self-awareness is just loneliness dressed up as independence. But when you begin to grow, when you become emotionally intelligent, confident, and grounded. You start living the kind of freedom they were chasing all along. You don't fear connection because you've learned to regulate your emotions. You don't run from love because you understand it doesn't threaten your identity, it expands it. And this is where the mirror effect begins. Your transformation exposes the contrast. While they remain guarded, you open. While they overthink, you feel. While they repeat cycles, you evolve. Without realizing it, you become living proof of what emotional courage looks like. You've faced what they refused to: vulnerability, accountability, healing. And nothing haunts an avoidant more than witnessing the growth. They were too afraid to experience themselves. This isn't about revenge or superiority. It's about evolution. Because the truth is, the person you become after heartbreak is often far wiser, calmer, and stronger than the one who went through it. Pain refines perception. It strips away illusions. You begin to see love differently, not as something you earn or maintain through effort, but as something you build through alignment. You stop chasing people who fear their own emotions because you now understand yours. You stop explaining your worth because you embody it. That's what real healing looks like. Not pretending you don't care, but no longer needing validation to know that you do. And when you reach that point, you start living with an entirely new energy. You stop reacting and start creating. You stop waiting for closure and start giving yourself peace. You stop defining your story by who left and start defining it by how you rose. That's the part that avoidants feel, but can't articulate. It's the quiet power of someone who turned pain into purpose. Someone who took what was meant to break them and used it as a blueprint for emotional mastery. It's almost poetic. The person who once triggered your deepest wounds becomes the catalyst for your highest growth. Because to love someone who fears love requires emotional strength. To let them go with grace requires wisdom. And to transform that loss into self-awareness requires courage. That courage is what separates those who stay stuck in cycles from those who rise out of them. You can't force an avoidant to evolve, but you can inspire them just by becoming the person they couldn't be. Over time, many avoidants circle back, not always physically, but emotionally. They'll remember your composure, your ability to love without control, your peace. And they'll recognize that you reached a level of maturity they once feared was impossible. But by then, you'll be in a different space, one where their recognition doesn't validate you. It simply confirms what you already know you grew. This is the real win. Not making them regret losing you, but becoming the version of yourself that no longer seeks that regret. When you evolve, you transcend the emotional power game. You stop needing them to see your worth because you finally see it for yourself. And here's the philosophical beauty of it all. Every relationship that breaks you is actually trying to break open something within you. The avoidant was never your destination. They were the mirror showing you where you still needed to heal. Once you see that, everything changes, but their regret becomes irrelevant. Your peace becomes the point. So let this be your takeaway. Don't wait for them to realize what they lost, become what they couldn't be. Because when you do, you don't just heal, you transcend. And that right there is the kind of strength that doesn't chase closure. It creates it. At some point in your healing journey, you stop wanting them to regret losing you. You stop checking if they've noticed your growth, if they miss your energy, if they replay the moments that you still remember. Because the real power isn't in being remembered. It's in moving forward so completely that you no longer need to be. That's what emotional liberation looks like. It's the point where their regret becomes a side note in your story, not the headline. The truth is, Regret is their teacher, not your reward. Avoidants regret deeply, but not always immediately. Their realization comes in waves, slow, quiet, and usually too late. At first, they feel relief, then confusion, then nostalgia. But beneath it all sits recognition. Recognition that they were loved by someone who didn't demand perfection, who offered safety, who reflected everything they were too afraid to face. But that recognition doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to them. Your lesson came earlier. Theirs comes through loss. When you truly step into your healing, you begin to understand something profound. You don't need to witness their regret for it to be real. Because what you're actually seeking isn't their apology. It's closure. And closure doesn't come from their mouth. It comes from your clarity. The moment you stop waiting for them to validate your experience is the moment you reclaim your power. You stop reacting to their absence and start responding to your own growth. You stop replaying the ending and start rewriting the meaning. You see, pain doesn't disappear just because you understand it. But when you give that pain purpose, it transforms. Every tear, every unanswered message, every sleepless night, it all becomes part of your evolution. The regret you once wanted from them becomes the proof of your own awakening. Because healing isn't about getting over someone. It's about getting back to yourself. The self you lost trying to love someone who couldn't meet you where you were. There's a shift that happens when you move from resentment to release. Resentment keeps you tethered to their energy, constantly needing acknowledgement, needing to win. Release, on the other hand, is quiet confidence. It says, I don't need your remorse to know my worth. That's not denial. That's emotional maturity. That's the moment when love stops being a battlefield and becomes a lesson. You start to see that what broke you was also building you. Every moment of rejection was pushing you closer to your own wholeness. And here's the paradox. Once you reach that level of peace, that's usually when avoidants begin to wake up. They sense the shift. The energy between you changes. You're no longer orbiting them emotionally. You've reclaimed your center, and they feel it. But by then, you've outgrown the version of yourself that once needed their approval. You've learned to fill your own space, to self-soothe, to find meaning beyond what ended. You become untouchable, not because you're cold, but because you're whole. That's what regret really is for an avoidant. It's not just missing you. It's realizing they no longer have access to you. It's seeing that the door they once walked through so easily is now closed, not locked in anger, but sealed with peace. That's the kind of loss that lingers, because regret is not about what they lost in the moment. It's about what they'll never experience again. And what they'll never experience again is you. The version of you that loved with grace, patience, and emotional depth. The beauty of this entire process is that it circles back to empowerment. You started by trying to understand why they left, and you end by understanding why you stayed. You stayed because you believed in connection, in empathy, in love that goes beyond ego. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's emotional intelligence in action. And when you realize that their regret becomes irrelevant, because you don't need to be their unfinished chapter, you've already written a new one for yourself. Philosophically, this is the heart of transformation. Moving from attachment to awareness, you begin to see relationships not as wins or losses, but as mirrors. Some reflect your light, others reveal your shadows. The avoidant reflected your need to be seen, but in their absence, you learn to see yourself. That's growth. That's healing. That's mastery. And so the redemption arc isn't about them realizing your value. It's about you realizing that their inability To love you fully never diminished it. You don't need to carry their regret. Let them have it. You've already turned yours into wisdom. You've already built something beautiful from what broke you. So if there's one thing to take away from all of this, let it be this: your peace is your power. The real revenge is not indifference. It's inner calm. When you reach a point where you can think of them without bitterness, remember them without pain, and thank them for the lesson, they no longer have any hold on you. Let them regret. Let them reflect. Let them relearn love at their own pace. Your job isn't to wait, it's to rise. Because the moment you choose peace over proof, healing over validation, and growth over resentment, you've already won. And that's the moment you realize closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from the person you've become.